What if your own thoughts were no longer yours? What if someone could flip a switch and turn your neighbors into killers, and your home into a hall of mirrors? In the summer of '51, a silent chemical hack was deployed against an unsuspecting town. It started with a metallic taste and ended with men jumping off bridges, believing they were airplanes. This is the story of Pont-Saint-Esprit, the moment the boundary between a laboratory and a living room was permanently erased. We aren't just looking at a tragedy. We are looking at the blueprint for how power can rewrite your reality without you ever knowing it's happening. Welcome to the experiment you never signed up for. The scent of a fresh baguette wafting through the cobblestone streets of Pont-Saint-Esprit in August 1951 should have been nothing more than the prelude to a lazy French afternoon. But within every golden crust of that bread hid an invisible molecule of absolute madness. The residents of this idyllic village woke to the rhythmic tolling of church bells, unaware that their morning ritual had been transformed into a cold communion for a secret experiment sanctioned thousands of miles away in the sterile offices of the Directorate of Special Operations. The first signs of the catastrophe manifested not in violence, but in a haunting, unnatural silence. As an elderly postman suddenly froze in the middle of the road, staring into the void with eyes full of a primal animal terror. He felt his own hands transforming into slithering, cold serpents, while the stones of the pavement beneath his feet began to throb and breathe like a living, opened piece of anatomy. In the air usually smelling of lavender and river water, there was a sudden, sharp, metallic taste of ozone and something acrid that made the lining of the nose itch and the consciousness slowly peel away from reality. By noon, the bakery owned by Monsieur Rochat, which supplied the entire town with bread, became the epicenter of an invisible explosion, tearing the lives of 500 people into small, jagged pieces of psychological debris. People who only that morning had discussed the grape harvest were now writhing in strange visions on cafe terraces, claiming that their insides were being consumed by celestial creatures made of pure light. The visual landscape of the city distorted beyond recognition as the walls of ancient stone houses began to flow downward like melted wax, and the faces of neighbors turned into grotesque masks of strangers with elongated features. Children whose delicate systems were the first to take the hit of the powerful psychotropic substance suddenly lost the gift of human speech, replacing it with guttural growls and fierce attempts to hide from their own parents, whom they no longer recognized. The sounds of the city turned into a frantic cacophony, where the ringing of broken glass mixed with the howling of confused dogs and the monotonous muttering of those trying to talk to the emptiness. No one in Pont-Saint-Esprit understood that this mass psychosis was a carefully planned action under the Central Intelligence Agency project, codenamed MK Delta. While local French doctors frantically tried to diagnose a mass poisoning of natural origin in the shadows of the dusty olive groves outside the city, men in sharp suits with absolutely cold faces methodically recorded every twitch and every cry in their black notebooks. They watched as a quiet commune turned into a vast petri dish, where instead of bacteria, pure undiluted madness was cultivated, devoid of all meaning or mercy. The sun, hanging over the Rhône Valley, seemed like a living, pulsating eye, watching as human civilization was washed away by a wave of chemical storm. On this day, bread ceased to be food, becoming a rusted key to the gates of a psychological abyss that swung open in the middle of the day to the accompaniment of weeping and the scratching of fingernails against wooden shutters. Every detail of this scene was saturated with a sense of irreversibility, as if nature itself shuddered at how easily the human mind can be turned to dust with only a single loaf of bread. The city sank into a twilight that brought no coolness, but only thickened the shadows of the monsters born in the test tubes of secret laboratories, and released into the wild to test the theory of total control. By the evening of the first day of the experiment, Pont-Saint-Esprit ceased to be a place where people lived, turning into a sealed, open-air laboratory where time stood still and the space filled with the cries of those who would never be able to return to the world of normal men. The sound of hundreds of people simultaneously losing their grip on reality within the walls of the local infirmary resembled a choir of the lost, trapped in a narrow concrete box, where the air was thick with the scent of sweat and a strange, cloying sweetness. By the night of August 16, 1951, Pont-Saint-Esprit had ceased to function as a social unit, transforming into a vast enclosure for beings who no longer recognized themselves in mirrors and could not recall their own names. In the narrow corridors of the hospital designed for a quiet provincial life, there was now a catastrophic shortage of beds, and patients lay directly on the cold, tiled floor, covering their eyes with their hands just to stop seeing the nightmares that had become their new and only reality. An elderly man whose mind had been completely hollowed out by the unknown synthetic substance threw himself from a second-story window, claiming in the final seconds of his leap that he was a silver aircraft, and the dull sound of his impact on the cobblestones became a brief accent in the general symphony of urban chaos. Doctors whose white coats were marked by the frantic struggle of the day broke the steel needles of their syringes in frustration, as the usual sedatives of the time had absolutely no effect on the victims, as if their nervous systems had been switched to a frequency inaccessible to conventional medicine. The physical details of this mass transformation were truly haunting, as the pupils of the people dilated to such an extent that the iris completely disappeared, turning their eyes into black, bottomless wells, reflecting an internal psychedelic fire. The skin of the afflicted took on a strange, earthy hue, and their muscles were seized in such wild and unnatural spasms that the fragile structure of their bodies seemed to buckle under the monstrous pressure of their own strength. One woman spent 5 hours staring with icy calm at the shadows on the wall, claiming that the shadows were whispering the secrets of the universe into her ear. The air in the wards became almost unbearable, a heavy mixture of acrid antiseptics and the musk of fear, creating a dense atmosphere in which even the most trained mind began to slowly succumb to the encroaching madness. On the streets of the city, submerged in a sticky nocturnal darkness, patrols of gendarmes repeatedly stumbled upon people crawling on all fours, trying to talk to the trees, or standing motionless for hours, staring at the moonlight, until their vision blurred from the strain. This was a total and final descent into an abyss organized with the precision of a Swiss watch and the cold calculation of military strategists. In the secret operations headquarters, hidden behind neutral signs in a neighboring district, biochemists from the Fort Detrick laboratory received hourly reports that the aerosol spray and the additive in the flour had worked in perfect synergy, far exceeding all preliminary expectations for the destruction of the personality. They discussed the concentration of the chemical and the rate of psychological decay with the same casual interest with which ordinary farmers discuss crops or soil fertilizers, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that behind their dry charts stood the shattered lives of 500 people. All of Pont-Saint-Esprit that night turned into a grand cinematic scene from a psychological thriller where the scenery remained familiar and peaceful, but all the actors had been replaced by broken, empty shells, devoid of memory or will. The silence of the night was finally destroyed by the sounds of frantic struggle and non-human wailing that echoed from every cellar and every open window. Every movement in this darkness was saturated with paranoia of the highest order, as yesterday's kind neighbors now saw each other as predatory monsters, and children hid under beds from parents whose faces had turned into pulsating, distorted masks in their inflamed imaginations. This was the peak of the first act of this tragedy, where primal terror became the only law of existence, and the bread eaten for an ordinary breakfast continued its quiet and destructive work within every cell of the brain. Each heartbeat of these people now echoed with a metallic scrape in their ears, reminding them that they no longer belonged to themselves, but were merely part of a complex biochemical equation. The scent of expensive tobacco and old leather in the offices of the French intelligence services on the Rue de Suresnes always seemed like a symbol of stability. But in late August 1951, it became the cover for the most extensive lie in the history of post-war Europe. While the residents of Pont-Saint-Esprit continued to struggle with their fractured realities, officials in Paris and Washington were feverishly coordinating every letter in the official press releases that were meant to bury the truth forever under a layer of medical terminology. The collusion between the leadership of the Central Intelligence Agency and the French authorities was not a random alliance, but a carefully calibrated deal, where the sanity of 500 provincials was the price paid for the loyalty of an entire country during the gathering storms of the Cold War. Telegrams sent through encrypted channels and declassified decades later show that the coordination of actions began even before the first loaf of tainted bread left the oven. Agents from the Special Operations Division, who arrived in France disguised as civilian agricultural specialists, brought with them not only the equipment for the experiment, but also ready-made templates from medical reports, which stated in black and white that the only acceptable cause was ergotism. The visual image of these negotiations is the dim light of luxurious halls with high ceilings, where men in perfectly tailored suits decided the fate of a town they had never seen, and residents they did not consider human. The sound of their voices, muffled by thick carpets and heavy drapes, was quieter than the rustle of the papers on which signatures were placed, securing the state's right to conduct biological experiments on its own population. In Pont-Saint-Esprit itself, strange men in civilian clothes began to appear, who did not ask questions about health, but very closely monitored exactly what the survivors were saying to their relatives and visiting journalists. The silence that settled in the city after the peak of the psychosis was not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear, when everyone understood that any extra word could lead to a mental institution without the right to correspond. Internal CIA reports dated September 1951 contain a phrase chilling in its cynicism, stating that the psychological shock of the population was an important additional factor for studying the stability of social bonds under chemical attack. They analyzed the breakdown of families and outbreaks of aggression as valuable statistical data, allowing them to calibrate the dosage for future, even more extensive operations. The smell of Pont-Saint-Esprit in those days was the smell of hopelessness, mixed with the aroma of river silt and chlorine, as they tried to wash the streets of the traces of human madness. We see French health officials, knowing the truth about the synthetic origin of the poison, obediently reading texts about harmful fungi in grain before the cameras, looking away from the lenses. It was a betrayal of national proportions, committed to maintain the alliance with Washington and receive new tranches under the Marshall Plan. Every detail of the official investigation was aimed at diverting suspicion from the secret laboratories of Fort Detrick and shifting the blame to an unfortunate baker whose life was ruined overnight. The sound of closing case files in the archives of the prefecture became the final chord of this stage of the operation, when Pont-Saint-Esprit was officially declared a zone of natural disaster. In Washington, the success was celebrated, as field trials confirmed the possibility of covertly managing the consciousness of large groups of people through the public food system. This discovery opened the doors for a whole series of experiments, which stretched over decades and affected thousands of lives on both sides of the ocean. The architects of silence performed their work flawlessly, as the world believed the lie, and the survivors were left alone with their nightmares, unable to prove that their minds had been violated by the order of the people who promised them protection. We look at these events today through the prism of declassified documents, and in every line, one feels the cold, deathly glint of the same scalpel that dissected the soul of an entire city. It was a time when morality finally gave way to efficiency, and compassion was recognized as an impermissible weakness for those who built a new world order on the ruins of human will. Truth possesses a frightening ability to survive in conditions of absolute darkness, waiting for its hour in folders that should have been burned before the dawn of a new era. And that moment arrived 58 years after the last cry of madness faded in the alleys of Pont-Saint-Esprit. In 2009, in the silence of the National Archives of the United States of America, where the air smells of vinegar, old cellulose, and preservation chemicals, a researcher named Hank Albarelli stumbled upon a document that turned an old urban legend into a documented nightmare of state proportions. Working on the case of the mysterious death of government scientist Frank Olson Albarelli, extracted from a cardboard box a thin, yellowed sheet of paper marked Project M, K Delta. And at that moment, time seemed to stand still for him. His fingers felt the chill of the old paper, and his eyes refused to believe what was typed on the machine decades ago, as in the list of places chosen for secret trials of synthetic psychotropic substances, the name Pont-Saint-Esprit stood on the first line, circled in bold pencil. The entire world, which for more than half a century had obediently believed in the convenient fairy tale about spoiled flour and a poisonous fungus, suddenly faced a reality where the entire population of a French province was used as experimental material for the calibration of a biological weapon. Albarelli's shocking discovery cut through the silence of the archive like a blade, exposing the rotten core of an operation that the CIA and military scientists from Fort Detrick considered their triumph. It turned out that in August 1951, in the shadows of the olive groves of Pont-Saint-Esprit, there were not ghosts, but very real vans with equipment for aerosol spraying. And the flour of the bakery had been spiked, not with a natural toxin, but with pure lysergic acid diethylamide, synthesized in the laboratories of Maryland. The visual images of the past, in the light of this find, acquired a new sinister clarity, as we now see not just crazed people, but victims of a targeted chemical violation of consciousness, whose every movement was monitored through the lenses of hidden cameras. The documents contain detailed charts of how quickly the substance enters the bloodstream and how long the effect of total destruction of the personality lasts, turning a person into a neutralized unit. The scent of this discovery was the scent of old, stagnant lies, finally coming to the surface, poisoning the present with the realization that the boundaries between scientific progress and absolute barbarism were erased by a single stroke of a high-ranking official's pen. In Pont-Saint-Esprit, when the news of Albarelli's archives reached the local residents, the air again filled with that same metallic taste of fear they remembered from their childhood. The elderly who survived that August wept, not from grief, but from rage, realizing that their pain, their losses, and their shattered families were merely lines in a report on the effectiveness of the impact per unit area. The sound of the pages of this dossier being turned in 2009 became a funeral knell for the trust in state institutions that for decades had covered up this crime under the pretext of protecting national security. Every page of the found archive was saturated with a cynicism of such a level that it did not fit into human consciousness as they discussed the cost of one portion of the substance compared to the potential damage to the enemy's psyche. We see how in the sterile offices of Washington in the middle of the 20th century, men in white coats and military uniforms discussed Pont-Saint-Esprit as a successful testing ground where an ideal concentration of chaos was achieved. This truth brought no relief, but only added a new layer of horror to into the history of the city, making it a monument to human arrogance and the ruthlessness of power. The cinematic scale of this betrayal was staggering, as thousands of people lived their lives for decades, not suspecting that their most terrible tragedy was merely a successfully conducted experiment. The silence that followed the publication of these documents was heavy and viscous, as if the world was afraid to admit that such a thing could happen in the heart of Europe under the patronage of the greatest democracies. Inside a sterile glass box, simulating the atmosphere of the French countryside, scientists in white protective suits, decades later, attempted to recreate the chemical formula of the very madness that covered Pont-Saint-Esprit in August 1951. It turned out that the secret of the effectiveness of this invisible weapon lay not in a simple spray of psychedelics, but in a monstrous synergy of the substance with heavy metal salts, which acted as catalysts, breaking through the protective barriers of the human brain in seconds. The scent in these modern laboratories, where the past was dissected, was the scent of absolute distilled coldness, as a sharp ozone mixed with the aroma of formaldehyde and a faint metallic aftertaste that always accompanies work with combat toxins. The protocols of the project revealed a frightening truth, as Pont-Saint-Esprit was not just a random place for a test, but was chosen as an ideal social reactor where one could study not only the individual response, but the complete collapse of the collective consciousness. We see on the pages of these reports how American biochemists from Fort Detrick, with icy calm, described the entry phase into psychosis using terms like variable data points and percentages of effectiveness, behind which were hidden the wailing of mothers and the final breaths of the elderly. The sound of the pages of these dossiers being turned resembles the rustle of bones in a cemetery of forgotten victims, where every word is a nail in the coffin of human morality. It became known that the agents working in the city under the guise of entomologists and agronomists used special equipment to enhance the impact of the substance on the nervous system of the residents. The visual image of this operation now appears before us in its true repulsive nakedness, as while the city plunged into bloody chaos, men in gray suits methodically recorded every detail of self-destruction on film, noting how quickly the trust between neighbors was replaced by a paranoid rage. The silence in the halls of Fort Detrick, where these recordings were analyzed, was interrupted only by the chatter of film projectors running frames in which the residents of Pont-Saint-Esprit turned into frightened animals trapped in the snare of their own minds. The scent of Pont-Saint-Esprit in those days was the scent of hot bread, saturated with a synthetic nightmare. And this scent still haunts those who dared to look into the deepest archives of the operation. It became known that the French secret services did not just silently watch what was happening, but actively participated in the falsification of evidence, replacing flower samples in laboratories, and forcing witnesses to sign non-disclosure documents under the threat of life imprisonment. It was a global machine of lies, the gears of which were lubricated with the blood and madness of innocent people for the sake of achieving a single goal of creating an ideal way of conducting non-contact warfare. Each graph in these dossiers, showing the peak of hospitalizations in August 1951, is a monument to the cynicism of those who considered themselves the architects of a new world order. We see how in closed universities of the United States of America, dissertations were defended on the methods of mass disorientation of the population, based on the data from Pont-Saint-Esprit, where human pain was translated into the category of dry statistical errors. The cinematic scale of this betrayal is staggering, as thousands of people lived for years in the shadow of this experiment, not suspecting that their genetic code and mental health were forever changed by the will of people whose names are still hidden behind black lines of censorship. The scent of this discovery is the scent of an old basement where the remains of the innocent have been kept for years. And this scent cannot be aired out by any official apologies or belated admissions. We stand before the face of a truth that tells us that for those who hold the syringes and control panels, we are merely expendable material in a grand game to seize control over the very essence of human existence. The sound of closing doors in the archives, where the final, still undisclosed volumes of this case are kept, sounds like a verdict on our right to the truth. The last living witness of those cursed events, an old man with almost transparent skin and fingers that had not stopped shaking since August 1951, sat on a crooked wooden bench at the very edge of the River Rhône, watching as the heavy crimson sun slowly sank into the turbid, oily water. His clouded gaze was fixed on that invisible point in space where reality had once suffered an irreversible crack, and in this ringing pre-sunset silence, he suddenly caught a sound that made his worn-out heart skip a heavy beat. It was not the usual sound of the coastal wind or the steady splash of river water against the stones, but a faint, familiar, low-frequency hum coming from the depths of a massive black van without license plates parked in the shadow of an old bridge on the opposite bank. In that very moment, an unpredictable and blood-chilling truth crashed down on him with a clarity that was 100 times worse than any lysergic madness, as the great experiment in Pont-Saint-Esprit had actually never been interrupted, but had simply transitioned into its longest and most hidden phase of observation, stretching over 75 long years. This town was not a random, one-time victim of crazed chemists, but was originally chosen as a permanent, closed, open-air laboratory, where successive generations of residents served as a living control group for studying the long-term genetic influence of a psychotropic background on the structure of human society. The scent in the evening air suddenly and sharply changed, filling with that same cloying, nauseating aroma of ozone and ammonia that the old man remembered from his distant childhood when his own mother, in a fit of rage, tried to smother him with a wet towel. The old man understood with terrifying clarity that all these long years, every one of their shy steps, every birth of a new child, and every quiet death in this lost town had been vigilantly monitored by the same faceless forces as on that fateful, sunny morning in the middle of the 20th century. The shocking realization that all their lives were nothing more than an endless series of encrypted data in a colossal digital file caused in him not a paralyzing fear, but an icy, crystal-clear, and all-consuming rage. He remembered the faces of those numerous doctors and social workers who politely came to the town every 5 years for supposedly routine screenings of the population. And now he knew for sure that they never treated them. They only methodically took readings from living biological sensors, recording the rate of degradation of their nervous systems. All these loud lawsuits, all the belated apologies of politicians, and even those supposedly accidentally declassified Albarelli documents were only part of an even more massive and cynical game of managing world public opinion designed to reliably hide the fact that the latch on their cage had never been opened by even a single millimeter. Visual images of the past and present in his mind finally merged into one endless nightmare tape as the boarded-up bakery and modern sterile supermarkets and old gendarmes and current silent drones circling in the twilight over the valley were all just different parts of the same eternal mechanism of suppression of the human will. The flash of this realization was so powerful and physically palpable that the old man felt his own brain begin to vibrate at the same unnatural frequency as the invisible radiation emanating from the black van. He understood that the genuine truth about Pont-Saint-Esprit was not at all a story about bread or the CIA, but a story about the complete, final, and legally fixed right of ownership of an anonymous state over the consciousness, memory, and the very soul of every individual. The anger accumulated inside him for decades broke out in a quiet, cracked, and eerie laughter, which soon turned into a hacking, dry cough, tearing his lungs. He looked at his trembling palms in the gathering darkness and saw with a horror of awe that the skin on them was beginning to emit a soft, ghostly, bluish light, which was the final side effect of the heavy metal salts accumulated in his bones, the secret purpose of which he had only just guessed. This was his indelible stigma, his personal inventory number in the registry of a global experiment, which he would carry in himself to the very grave, and which had already been passed on to his children and grandchildren through tainted blood. The sun finally and irrevocably disappeared behind the horizon, leaving Pont-Saint-Esprit in a thick shadow, where invisible observers with thermal imagers and motion sensors continued their routine work, dispassionately recording the reaction of the last living witness to the realization of the final truth. The city fell asleep under the steady, barely audible hum of powerful equipment hidden in the cellars of old houses and behind the sides of vans, remaining that very place where ordinary bread for breakfast could still turn out to be the last thing you eat as a free being. The emotional finale of this 75-year-old story lies not in solving an old mystery, but in the crushing understanding that no exit from this global laboratory exists in principle, and each of us, perhaps, has long been part of exactly the same list securely hidden in a safe, under the heading Top Secret. The old man slowly closed his eyes, and in his fading consciousness, the last bright image was that very crispy golden crust of a baguette, which in 1951 forever deprived his world of warmth and color, replacing them with the eternal, sterile cold of experimental silence. Look at your hands in the dark, and does it not seem to you that they are also beginning to emit this barely noticeable ghostly blue light, indicating that your dossier in this great game has also long been open and is waiting for its final chord? On this, the story of the incident in Pont-Saint-Esprit comes to its conclusion, leaving us alone with the silence in which the sound of working servers storing the truth about who we really are in the eyes of those who manage our dreams is clearly audible. The declassified dossier is closed, but its pages continue to pulse with invisible poison, reminding us that the most terrible lie is the one we voluntarily accept as part of our everyday reality. Take care of your mind, for it is the only thing that does not yet fully belong to them. Although, after listening to this story, you can no longer be sure of this to the end. The time of the experiment has come to an end. The time of realization begins. And this realization will cost you everything you considered yours by right of birth in this world of shadows and hidden laboratories.